The king's Indian defense is one of the most used defenses against the move d4. It is the favorite of the Grand Masters because it allows a very active game and is very rich in tactical and strategic content. In this video you will learn the typical plans of this powerful defense. Black's typical development scheme is to develop the king's knight on its natural square. Then, develop the king's bishop through the fianchetto, using the maneuver g6 and bishop g7. Black usually castle on the king side. The d6 move is typical in the king's Indian defense and completes the pawn structure in the center. Thanks to this move, Black will be able to attack against the opponent's pawn center through the e5 or c5 breaks. The queen's knight can be developed on the c6 square or the d7 square, depending on the circumstances. Normally the queen's bishop tends to remain for a long time on its original square, but that is not a problem, since from the c8 square it exerts its influence on the kingside and supports an eventual attack with f5. The king's Indian defense offers Black very good options to play for the win from the very first moves. After the move d4, Black can play knight f6. Developing the king's knight along its natural square and taking control of the e4 square. White can play c4, to increase his control over the central squares. g6. Black wants to develop his king's bishop through the fianchetto, where it will be very well placed, since it will occupy the large diagonal of dark squares and exert pressure against the center. Knight c3. White develops his queen's knight and wants to continue with e4, to occupy the center with his pawns. Bishop g7. Black plays in a hypermodern style. They allow the opponent to occupy the center with their pawns, and then attack them with their pieces from the distance. e4. White occupies the center with his pawns. Now White threatens to advance with e5, which would give them an advantage. d6, to control the e5 square and prevent the white pawn from advancing further. Now, it is not possible to advance with e5, as Black simply captures the pawn. And after d takes e5, Black can change queens. If White captures with the knight, then the Black knight has access to the e4 square and Black has a very good game. And, if White captures with the king, then Black plays knight g4 and is winning. After the move d6, White has several possibilities. For example, they can play knight f3, developing their king's knight towards its natural square, which is the classic system. Now Black can castle. And now White can play bishop e2, developing his king's bishop and preparing to castle. Black can play e5, the typical break in the king's Indian defense. Once he has secured his king, Black places a pawn in the center and attacks the d4 pawn, with the idea of destroying the opponent's powerful center. Now White has three possibilities. They can exchange pawns, they can advance their attacked pawn, or they can stay still, maintaining tension. If White captures on e5, Black answers d takes e5. And after the exchange of queens, if White now captures the pawn on e5, Black can respond with knight takes e4, recovering the pawn and leaving himself with an advantage. Since, if White captures the Black knight, Black will be able to capture the e5 knight with his bishop and will have an advantage, since his bishop dominates the large diagonal of dark squares and White has difficulty completing its development. Black dominates the d4 square and they have a very good game. And, if White captures on f7, with the intention of keeping the extra pawn, Black can respond bishop takes c3 check and wins. Since after b takes c3, king takes f7, black is left with a material advantage. After the exchange of queens, white can try bishop g5, pinning the f6 knight, with the idea of continuing with knight d5 and increasing the pressure on the knight. Black can play rook e8, avoiding the pin and defending the e5 pawn, to prevent the white knight from capturing it. After knight d5, white attacks the pawn on c7 and the knight on f6. Black can remove the white knight from the center. And after c takes d5. Black can continue with c6, attacking against the d5 pawn, with the idea of destroying the opponent's pawn center. After bishop c4. C takes d5. Bishop takes d5. Black plays knight d7 and has a very good game. They will be able to maneuver with the knight to take it to the e6 square, from where it will attack the g5 bishop and aim for the f4 and d4 squares, which will be excellent outposts in the enemy camp. After the move e5, white can also advance with d5, to prevent black from capturing on d4 and thus keep his pawns united in the center. This is the Petrosian variation. Now, since the knight cannot go to the c6 square, black plays knight b to d7. The knight can go towards the c5 square, to increase the pressure against the e4 pawn. White can play bishop g5, completing the development of his minor pieces and pinning the knight on f6. Black can play h6, to avoid the pin and force the enemy bishop to retreat. After bishop h4. Black plays g5, attacking the opposing bishop and forcing it to retreat. After bishop g3. Black plays knight h5, with the idea of taking the knight to the f4 square, where he will be very well placed. Black has a very good game. If white now plays h4, with the idea of trying to attack on the king side. Black answers g4, preventing the h-file from opening and attacking the opposing knight. After knight d2. Black captures the bishop on g3, to ruin the opponent's pawn structure. After h takes g3. Black plays h5 and has a very favorable pawn structure. Now white can castle. And black plays bishop h6, activating the bishop and taking control over this diagonal. Black can continue with moves like a5, to take control of the b4 square and secure the c5 square for the knight. With the move c6, they will be able to attack in the center and clear the way to take the queen towards the b6 square, from where she will aim against the enemy king in attack against the b2 pawn. They can also prepare the break with f5. Black has a very good game and will be able to attack on the king side. The third possibility that white has after the move e5 is to stay still, maintaining the tension in the center. For example, they can now castle. Black can play knight c6, developing the queen's knight to its natural square and increasing the pressure on the d4 point. If white now advances his pawn to d5, to gain space and attack the opposing knight, black responds with knight e7. The center has been closed and in this type of position the game moves to the flanks. White will attack on the queen side, and try to break with c5. For his part, black will try to attack on the king side, making the break f5, attacking against the base of white's pawn chain and preparing the attack against the enemy king. A very complex fight will take place, in which timing will be very important and each side will try to accelerate its attack as much as possible while trying to stop the opponent's attack. Normally, in this type of position black will try to avoid the exchange of queens and will also try to keep his c8 bishop, since they are key pieces so that the attack on the king side can be successful. Black's plan is to remove his knight from f6, then advance with f5 and start the attack on the king side. From the h5 square he can then jump to the f4 square, which is a good position in the enemy camp for the knight, since from this square he will press against the opponent's castling. If it is not possible to get the knight to h5, black can relocate his knight to the e8 or d7 square and then continue with f5. Black's plan is to advance his pawns on the kingside and bring all his pieces to attack against the enemy king. After the move knight c6, white can also play bishop e3, completing the development of his minor pieces and reinforcing the defense of the d4 pawn. Black can play rook e8, activating his king's rook and aiming for the e4 pawn. Black's idea is to capture on d4, to release the action to his rook and press against the e4 pawn. If now white advances the pawn to d5. Black can play knight d4, placing his knight on a good square in the center. After knight takes d4. E takes d4. The e4 pawn is exposed. Black is going to capture it and they have a very good game. After rook e8, white can also capture on e5. After d takes e5. The d4 square is a weakness in white's field and can be an excellent position for black's pieces. After the exchange of queens. White can play knight b5, attacking against the pawns on c7 and a7. Black can respond by knight e6, defending the c7 pawn and aiming for the d4 square, which is a key square in the center. The black knight is very well placed on e6, since from there it dominates many squares. White cannot capture the e5 pawn, because black captures the e4 pawn and has the advantage. White can try to knight g5, defending the e4 pawn and attacking against the e6 knight, to try to capture the c7 pawn. Black can reply rook e7, to defend the c7 pawn. Now it is not good to capture the pawn on a7, since black plays knight d4, blocking the action to the bishop on e3 and attacking two minor pieces. If white plays rook f to d1, with the idea of invading with the rook on the last rank. Black can play knight d4, placing the knight on a strong square in the center and blocking the action to the opposing rook. After knight takes d4. E takes d4. In case bishop takes d4, black captures the e4 pawn. After bishop takes g7. King takes g7. The white knight is attacked. After knight takes e4. Rook takes e4. The white bishop is attacked. After bishop f3. Black plays rook e8 and the game is balanced. Or, if white captures with the rook to defend the e4 pawn. Black can play bishop g4, completing the development of his minor pieces and preventing the opposing rook from invading the last rank. The bishop on e2 is attacked. And after f3. Black can play h6, counterattacking against the enemy knight and has a very good game. For example, after f takes g4. H takes g5. The pawn on e4 is very weak. The rook on d4 is in danger of being attacked by the bishop from g7 and black has a very good game. White also has other possibilities to fight against the king's Indian defense, which we will see in other videos.